Very soon, we will witness the story of the Titanic and its sinking process. At the moment of impact, we will see this from within the ship. We will look at the real images of the iceberg that sank the Titanic and the traces it left on the ship. Then we'll conduct an experiment to learn what those who fell into the water experienced, and we will follow the truth. The sound you just heard was the distress call sent from the Titanic via telegraph, and other ships received help requests sent by Morse signals. The Titanic was slowly beginning to sink. At the telegraph was Jack Phillips, a 25-year-old young man who remained at his post until the communications room was submerged in water. That young man acted heroically to the end. Yet nothing he did produced results. The Titanic would not be found until 73 years after it sank, and everything would begin with the discovery of the wreck. The mysterious story of the Titanic, all of it, began many years ago. In 1912, 111 years ago from now, in large bold letters, a headline read, "Titanic set off on its maiden voyage," and the newspaper included an image of the ship and its ticket prices. The story of the Titanic actually rested on a challenge. Transatlantic passenger trade, transporting wealthy travelers and immigrants, was a very profitable and innovative business, and companies competing for that were intense. In particular, two companies were in a race. The White Star Line Company wanted to build two ships and break the record crossing the Atlantic. To answer this challenge, they chose not to build fast ships, but instead in 1908 formed a workforce mostly of Irish laborers, practically a worker army, with the mindset of building a revolutionary passenger ship, the largest, most luxurious, and most comfortable ship ever designed. "We may not be fast, but who wants to spend an ocean crossing vomiting?" they said. That was their motto. Their aim was to be dominant on the Europe-America route within 5 years. Ultimately, the massive ship, the Olympic, was launched into the water, the largest ship the world had seen until then. Weighing 45,000 tons, the ship had a capacity of 1,000 people. Shortly after, the company would launch another, even more anticipated ship, the Titanic. About 14,000 people helped build the Titanic. To witness the launch of the Titanic, some 200,000 people gathered. Watching it being lowered into the water, they felt as if not a ship, but the ground itself was moving beneath them. For people living then, it was a gigantic vessel. The Titanic's anchor alone weighed 15 tons. Its interior was fitted with the most showy items and the most expensive furnishings. Some even suggested that instead of this display, the money should have gone into technology, because at that time, ships with 4 propellers and higher maneuvering ability were being built. But the White Star Line chose not to forefront Titanic's technology. On the 10th of April 1912, the Titanic set out on its maiden voyage from England, commanded by Captain Smith. At midday, she left England, first bound for the French port of Cherbourg, then Queenstown, now Cobh, and after that to New York. As the ship departed the port, the operators were warned that on the southbound crossing there might be icebergs. These were routine warnings in the Atlantic and often treated as ordinary. At about 21:30, a ship ahead of Titanic, the Masaba, reported seeing large icebergs in the area of the ship's route. However, though the warning was received by Titanic's operator Phillips and Harrell, it was not forwarded to the captain. because at that moment they were busy transmitting the first-class passengers' messages to relatives in New York by telegraph. The air had suddenly grown much colder, as though the chill breath of death was somewhere nearby. The sea lay as still as a sheet. On Titanic, there were lookouts in the crow's nest, and two watchers swapped places every 2 hours. Approaching midnight, the ship sailed south of Grand Banks, and a lookout suddenly spotted something in the darkness ahead of the bow that he could not make out. It turned out to be iceberg. Frederick rang the ship's bell 3 times and called the bridge by phone. First Officer Murdoch gave the order, "Hard starboard," turned the ship's wheel sharply. Although Titanic's speed was only about 40 kilometers per hour, with that massive mass, it was already impossible to stop in time. Just 37 seconds later, at 23:40, the ship collided with the iceberg on its starboard forward side. The iceberg sliced the ship like a razor. The structural backbone of the ship buckled in many places. Rivets under the water gave way, and 5 compartments began filling with water. Captain Smith called the ship's designer, Thomas, and asked for a damage report. When Thomas went down to inspect the compartments, he saw the dreaded truth. 5 compartments were flooding at a rate of roughly 400 tons of water per minute. The ship was now unsailable, and they accepted that. Their only remaining task was to evacuate the ship quickly. The captain announced that the lifeboats would first be for women and children. The passengers were awakened and told that the ship was to be abandoned. Now only panic pervaded the ship. One of the things that needed to be done was send for help. In a dangerous situation, the nearby ships would be sent more signals. Meanwhile, operators in the communications room were busy transmitting the first-class passengers' paid telegrams to relatives and did not want to handle ordinary messages. During the voyage, warnings and messages came from other ships. For example, further north, the California had been unable to proceed in the evening because of heavy icebergs, and they decided to spend the night where they were. At that time, California's operator, Evans, sent a warning to Titanic. "Look out, we are held up by icebergs. Be careful." Titanic's operator, Phillips, who was swamped by messages from first-class passengers, replied, "Shut up, I'm busy right now." Sometime later, Captain Smith himself came and ordered, "Send the wireless for help immediately." The operators could reach every ship within a 400-mile radius. The nearest ship, 32 kilometers away, was California, but it did not respond. As minutes went by, another ship answered the distress call, but it was too far, and they were told to contact another vessel. The nearest ship that responded was the Carpathia, and they began to set course. According to calculations, it would arrive in 4 hours, but the Titanic only had 2 hours left. They realized that no help was coming. The ship's forward section was already completely submerged, and the aft started to rise into the air. Meanwhile, on the California after midnight, 1:15, the operator noted that a rocket was fired from the Titanic. Captain Lord asked his crew if these rockets were distress signals. The rockets were actually flares used for identification and warning. But the maritime regulations of the time were incomplete, and Captain Lord was confused and told his crew, "Keep watching and send purple signals to other ships." Then at 1:53, more flares were sent from the Titanic, and California's operator observed the Titanic's stern rising at a 45-degree angle. At 2:15, the ship was no longer visible, And at about 5:30 in the morning, the California's operator tried to message Titanic's operator Phillips, unaware that Phillips was now resting on the Atlantic seabed. While the Carpathia had been just 32 kilometers away all night, they failed to help because of a silly captain and his mate. They had heard the screams of people dying in the freezing water beneath them. The Titanic hit the iceberg at 23:40, and by about 2:20, it was completely submerged. At dawn, some of the ships en route arrived in the area. A lucky few survived. Images taken from the rescuing ship show the iceberg that sank the Titanic and the impact traces. You can clearly see the path the ship took when you look at the fractures in the iceberg. Here is the Carpathia. Had its captain heeded the warning signals and come sooner, perhaps hundreds more might have survived. After the ship sank, there were people still alive on the surface, but the real agony awaited those left behind. Dr. Mike Zorlu, an expert on survival conditions, would demonstrate what killed those who survived in the water on the Titanic. He first set the water temperature to about 12 degrees Celsius, which in the actual 1912 site is 5 to 6 degrees Celsius lower, for safety reasons. A volunteer's manual skills and strength were checked. Then a thermal camera measured body temperature. The volunteer was slowly immersed. The sudden drop in skin temperature sharply activated cold receptors, which the central nervous system registered, and the body involuntarily began movement in order to heat itself. This is why we shiver when cold. After around 20 minutes, the volunteer began severe shivering. He had to get out of the water or risk hypothermia. The thermal camera revealed the result. The volunteer's body temperature dropped as though a piece of metal, and his strength and dexterity were reduced by about 60% and nearly 40% respectively. The people who fell into the water from the Titanic likely died within about half an hour in excruciating conditions. It is known that the Titanic sank after hitting an iceberg, and no other cause has been seriously proposed. But was the ship built with cheap materials? In the early 1900s, steel was newly used, and there were difficulties in initial usage. On the Titanic, especially in the forward hull, old-fashioned iron rivets were used. These rivets were placed through two metal plates, and the protruding end melted to hold them in place, essentially welding the plates together. When tested in an experimental environment, these rivets proved very strong. So at those speeds, a side impact alone should not have caused the ship to sink. So how did the ship start to take on water? There had to be something overlooked. The iron rivets were quite solid and could have held the ship together under that impact. But the impact did not occur as a side hit. The Titanic scraped along the iceberg. At that moment, the rivets, many of them protruding like mushrooms, sheared off one by one, and the hull suffered an approximately 9-meter-long opening. Thus, the Titanic did not strike perpendicularly, but at a glancing angle which made the damage catastrophic. Actually, the process had begun much earlier. That night was really bizarre. There was no moon in the sky, and the sea was incredibly calm. According to researcher Tim Martin, frequent air mass shifts had turned the air into a giant lens. What was above became clear, and what was below became blurred. This, in effect, hid the iceberg somewhat. For this reason, the iceberg may have only been detected when the ship was about 1 kilometer away. It is said that the Titanic's lookouts did not have binoculars. Though even if they had a binocular, that alone might not have changed much, since a person sees something with naked eye first, then uses binoculars to examine it. If they had binoculars, they would have definitely seen the iceberg. That's not quite the right way to put it. On another front, there is an ocean current that each year breaks off icebergs from Greenland and carries them towards Canada in the northern United States. This current is called the Labrador Current. The iceberg that the Titanic struck and that caused its sinking had broken off 300 days earlier from Greenland, traveled months during its journey, and then reached this very spot. Fate had it that this one iceberg formed from snowflakes that had fallen thousands of years ago and compacted into a 1.5 million ton mass would hide behind the night and meet the Titanic on its path, sending it to the depths of the Atlantic. About 2 hours after the Titanic sank, at around 5:30 the next morning, ships on their way arrived in the area. Some people had survived the disaster. From the rescuing ship, you can see the iceberg that sank the Titanic and the traces of the collision. The fractures show the path of the ship quite clearly. The number of lives lost was about 1,500 people. Most were men and from the lower classes. Captain Smith was among them. In fact, this would have been his last assignment before retirement, but he retired from life instead. Describing what happened is truly impossible. Just 3 hours earlier, people have been in their staterooms, talking and socializing. Only moments before, kissing their children goodnight, they would soon surrender those children to icy waters. Fathers would watch their families slip away. Some wives would be widowed. The children left behind would never forget that day. Music, music, music. There are indeed many more unknowns behind the Titanic's short history. Up next, we will look at the Lord Marion type reports and experiments. We will see the real scarring on the Titanic's hull from the iceberg and incredible images of the Titanic wreck. Don't forget to reserve your place for the second part. And before that, take 2 seconds to like the video and subscribe to the channel. See you next time.